The cathedral doors opened, and Sasha stepped into the light. She moved down the aisle slowly, her hand resting on her father's arm, her eyes fixed on the man waiting at the altar. 6 years of her life led to this walk. 6 years of covering his rent when his company nearly folded. 6 years of sitting up until 3 a.m. proofreading his investor decks. 6 years of telling herself that love meant giving until there was nothing left to give. She smiled through tears she didn't bother to hide, because today, finally, felt like the reward for all of it. Guests rose from their seats as she passed. Someone in the third row was already crying. Her mother pressed a hand to her chest. Her father, walking beside her, kept glancing at her sideways with the quiet pride of a man who'd spent 18 months privately worrying he'd never get to walk his daughter down an aisle at all, given how many times the wedding date had shifted around Henry's business trips and Henry's investors and Henry's schedule. And there, at the end of the aisle, stood Henry, tall and composed in his tailored charcoal suit, watching her come toward him the way a man watches something he's about to lose. She didn't know that yet. She only knew the organ music, the scent of white peonies, the weight of her grandmother's pearl earrings against her neck. 10 steps from the altar, Henry moved. Not toward her, away from her. He stepped sideways, past the priest, past the flower arrangement taller than a child, and reached for a hand in the second pew. Ashanti's hand. Sasha's cousin in a blush pink dress that was almost the shade of a bridesmaid's gown, but not quite, close enough that no one had questioned it that morning. The cathedral did not gasp. It went silent in the specific way 300 people go silent when they realize they are witnessing something they will talk about for years. Henry held Ashanti's hand and turned to face the woman he had asked to marry him 18 months ago, the woman who had rearranged her entire life around the promise of this exact day. And he said the words plainly, almost gently, like he believed gentleness could soften what he was about to do. I can't marry someone I don't love anymore. He didn't shout it. He didn't perform it. That was the part that would stay with Sasha longer than anything else, how ordinary his voice sounded, like he was declining a second helping of food at dinner. Every face in that cathedral turned toward her at once. Sasha felt the heat climb up her neck first, then her ears, then behind her eyes. She thought about screaming. She thought about walking straight up to the altar and asking him, in front of everyone, how long. She thought about 100 things in the space of 2 seconds, and she did none of them. Instead, she looked down at the bouquet in her hands, white peonies and ranunculus, chosen because they were her grandmother's favorite, and she walked forward, past Henry, past Ashanti, and laid the flowers gently on the front pew. No slamming, no breaking, just the quiet click of stems against polished wood. Then she turned around and walked out of the cathedral, her heels striking the marble floor in a steady rhythm that refused to shake, even as everything inside her did. Outside, the sky had turned the color of wet concrete, and the first drops of rain hit her bare shoulders before she'd made it down the front steps. She kept walking, past the town cars lined up along the curb, past the photographer who didn't know whether to lower his camera, past her own reflection caught for half a second in the tinted window of a limousine that was supposed to carry her and Henry to the reception. She didn't call anyone. She didn't check her phone, which had already started buzzing in the small clutch bag she still, absurdly, carried. She just walked in her wedding dress in the rain until the noise of the cathedral disappeared behind her, and the only sound left was her own breathing and the soft slap of rain against silk. Hours passed that way. She never fully remembered how she ended up near the old stone bridge on the edge of the business district, the one tourists photographed for its ironwork railings, the one locals used as a shortcut between the financial towers and the antique shopping street. She sat on the low stone wall overlooking the water, her dress soaked through, her makeup long gone, her arms wrapped around herself less for warmth and more because she needed to be holding something, even if it was only her own body. A black sedan slowed on the road behind her, then stopped. She didn't turn around. She assumed it was someone's driver, lost, or a stranger about to ask if she needed help in the way strangers ask questions they don't actually want answered. The door opened. Footsteps unhurried crossed the wet pavement. A coat settled over her shoulders before she'd even registered the man was close enough to touch her. Dark wool, warm from being worn, smelling faintly of cedar and something sharper underneath, like the air right before a storm breaks. "You looked cold," he said, nothing more dramatic than that. She looked up. He was tall, dressed simply for a man who arrived in a car like that, dark sweater, dark trousers, no tie, no performance. His face was calm in a way that made her suspicious of it, the calm of someone who had trained himself never to look surprised by anything. "I didn't ask for company," she said, because it was the only true thing she could manage. "I know." He crouched slightly, setting something on the wall beside her, a paper cup, steam rising off the lid despite the rain. "Would you mind if I kept you company for a while anyway?" She almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the first kind thing anyone had said to her in 6 hours, and her body didn't know what to do with kindness that didn't come with a price attached. "Why?" she asked. He considered the question longer than she expected. "Because I passed you twice already tonight, and both times you were sitting exactly like this. I wanted to know if the third time would be different." "It's not." "No," he agreed. "But you're wearing my coat now, so it's a little different." That was Doha. She wouldn't learn his name until later, wouldn't learn what that name meant to half the businessmen and nearly all of the underworld in the city until much later than that. That night, he was only a stranger with a coffee cup and a coat and a strange, patient stillness that asked nothing of her. He sat down on the wall, a careful distance away, and didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. Her dress told him enough, and whatever else he already knew, he kept to himself. They stayed there until the rain stopped, saying almost nothing, and when he finally stood to leave, he left a card on the wall beside her, no name, just a number written in blue ink. "If you ever need honest work," he said, "call that number, no conditions." Then he was gone, the sedan pulling away into the wet streets, and Sasha sat alone with a stranger's coat still around her shoulders, wondering if she'd imagined the whole thing. She hadn't. If a story like this, the kind where the worst night of your life quietly becomes the beginning of something you never saw coming, is the kind of story you love, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe now, because what happens next is going to change everything. The wedding scandal broke before sunrise. Someone in the cathedral had filmed the entire exchange on their phone, and by the time Sasha woke up on Naomi's, on Tia's couch the next morning, her name was trending under hashtags she refused to read. Tia had been the one to find her wandering near the bridge close to midnight, half in shock, still wearing the ruined dress, and had bundled her into a cab without asking a single question until they were safely behind a locked door. "You don't have to talk about it," Tia said, setting a mug of tea in front of her on the kitchen counter. "But I'm not going anywhere, so whenever you're ready." Sasha wrapped both hands around the mug and stared at the steam curling off the top. He didn't even look sorry. "He will be, give it time." "I don't want him to be sorry. I want 6 years of my life back." Tia didn't offer platitudes. She just sat across from her, arms folded on the counter, and let the silence do the work that words couldn't. Sasha's phone buzzed against the counter for the 11th time that morning. She didn't reach for it. She already knew who it would be, her mother, asking in circles whether she was eating, whether she'd slept, whether she needed anything. None of the questions actually about food or rest, but all of them a mother's way of asking whether her daughter was still standing. She would call back later. Right now, she wasn't ready to explain herself to anyone who'd witnessed it in person. "I keep thinking about the flowers," Sasha said eventually, turning the mug slowly between her palms. "Not him, not her. The flowers. I picked those because my grandmother loved ranunculus, and I stood there thinking, don't let this dress get wrinkled. Don't let the flowers wilt before the photos, like any of that mattered anymore." "That's shock," Tia said gently. "Your brain grabs onto whatever small thing it can still control." "I keep waiting to feel like I'm about to fall apart, and I don't. I just feel hollow, like someone scooped everything out and forgot to tell me." "You gave that man 6 years, Sasha. Hollow is allowed. Hollow is honest." Sasha managed something close to a laugh, thin and unconvincing. 6 years. I helped him hire his first architect. I sat in the hospital waiting room when his father had his heart attack because his own mother couldn't get there in time. I learned to like whiskey because he liked whiskey. And he stood at that altar and talked about not loving me anymore like I was a lease he'd decided not to renew. He's a coward, Tia said flatly. A coward who let you build his whole life and then blamed you for it not feeling like his own choice anymore. That's not on you. Sasha didn't answer. She stared at the window instead, at the gray morning light pressing against the glass, and let herself, for just a moment, imagine what the day was supposed to have looked like. The reception, the first dance, the toast her father had probably rehearsed for weeks. All of it gone, replaced by a stranger's coat still draped over the back of a kitchen chair, the only proof that something gentle had happened on the worst night of her life. Across the city, in a penthouse office on the 40th floor of Kang Global Holdings, Doha stood in front of a wall of screens showing the same footage looping on every major network. His assistant hovered near the door, unsure whether to speak. "Sir, the 12 o'clock call with the shipping consortium." "Reschedule it." Doha didn't turn from the screen. He watched the moment Henry took Ashanti's hand, watched Sasha's face freeze, and then, a beat later, watched her walk forward and set down the flowers instead of falling apart the way everyone in that cathedral had clearly expected her to. Something about that composure sat with him the way few things did anymore. "Pull everything we have on Brooks' development," he said finally. "Quietly. I want to understand who this man is before I decide whether he matters." The assistant blinked. "Should I ask why, sir?" "No," Doha said. "You shouldn't." That was the version of him the boardrooms knew, precise, unreadable, allergic to explaining himself. It was not the version that had crouched beside a stranger in the rain and handed her a coffee because he couldn't make himself drive past a third time. 3 days later, Sasha called the number on the card. Not because she believed in strangers with coats and coffee, but because her savings had thinned considerably after years of quietly subsidizing Henry's ambitions. And because Tia kept saying, gently but insistently, that sitting in an apartment replaying the worst morning of her life wasn't a plan. A woman answered, professional and unhurried. "Kang Group Property Development, Interiors Division. How can I direct your call?" Sasha almost hung up. Kang Group was not a small company. It was the kind of name that appeared on skyline projects and hotel openings, the kind of name attached to buildings she'd admired from a distance and assumed she'd never work anywhere near. "I was told to call about design work," she said carefully. "I don't have an appointment. I'm not even sure this is the right department." There was a pause, then the sound of typing. "Is this Sasha by chance?" Her stomach dropped slightly. "Yes." "We've been expecting your call. Mr. Doha asked that you be scheduled directly, whenever you were ready." The meeting took place 2 days later in a glass-walled office on the 15th floor, considerably less imposing than the 40th, which she wouldn't understand the significance of until much later. Doha wore a suit this time, and for a moment she almost didn't recognize him without the rain and the coat and the low light of the bridge. "You didn't have to save me a spot," she said, sitting across from him, portfolio in her lap like armor. "I didn't save you anything." He slid a folder across the desk. "You have a design background. We have 3 properties that need interior work done well and done honestly. I don't do people favors, Sasha. I do business with people I trust." "You don't know me well enough to trust me." "I know enough," he said, and didn't elaborate. She flipped through the folder, more out of habit than genuine interest, and found herself slowing down at the 3rd property, a 5-star restoration project near the Old Harbor District, the kind of commission any junior designer in the city would have fought for. "This is out of my range. I've done boutique hotels and private residences. I haven't touched anything at this scale." "You redesigned the Choi residence last spring," he said. "The one with the courtyard garden that flooded every monsoon season until you regraded it. I saw the before and after." She looked up sharply. "How do you know about that project? It never got covered anywhere." "I make it my business to know who's good at what they do before I decide who gets access to my buildings." He said it simply, without any attempt to make it sound impressive, which somehow made it land harder than if he had. "I don't do people favors, Sasha. I do business with people I trust to do the work properly." "You don't know me well enough to trust me." "I know enough," he repeated, and this time something in his voice made it clear the conversation was closed. She took the job because the alternative was watching her bank account continue its slow collapse while she waited for a version of dignity that never seemed to show up on its own. She told herself it was strictly professional. She told herself that for almost 3 weeks, until the meetings started running longer than they needed to, until he started remembering small details she'd mentioned only once. The tea she preferred, the fact that she hated elevators with mirrored walls, the anniversary of her grandmother's death that fell on a Tuesday she'd mentioned in passing, and he somehow didn't forget. What she didn't know, walking into those glass-walled meeting rooms every week with her sketches and mood boards, was that every property she'd been assigned belonged to a network far larger and far more dangerous than any development company had business owning. The lobby she redesigned for an executive retreat outside the city doubled as a secure meeting point for men whose names never appeared on any public registry. The renovation she oversaw for a private members club sat 2 floors above a room where disputes between rival organizations were settled without lawyers. She was, without knowing it, walking daily through the architecture of Korea's most powerful criminal network, admiring the natural light and recommending warmer paint tones for rooms where decisions had been made about far darker things than color palettes. The first time she noticed something was wrong, it wasn't dramatic. It was a man at the members' club renovation, tall, scarred along one eyebrow, dressed in a suit too expensive for what she assumed was ordinary security work, who bowed to Doha with a formality that seemed almost military and addressed him with a title she didn't recognize. "Supreme Boss," the man said quietly, before catching himself and switching to English for her benefit, calling him only Sir for the rest of the conversation. Sasha said nothing. She filed it away the way she'd learned to file away things that didn't add up, telling herself there was probably a simple explanation. The way people tell themselves things when the alternative is too large to process, standing in a half-finished lobby holding paint swatches. The relationship between them shifted anyway, whether she named what was happening or not. He started arriving to check on the properties more often than any CEO reasonably needed to. She started finding reasons to text him project updates late in the evening, longer than the updates required. Somewhere between the 3rd property and the 4th, she laughed at something he said, genuinely laughed, the first time since the wedding, and he looked at her like he'd just witnessed something rare enough to be worth remembering. "You should do that more," he said. "Laugh. At my jokes, specifically. I don't get many opportunities to be funny." "You're not that funny." "I'll accept feedback," he said, from someone who's clearly an expert in men who disappoint her. It should have stung. Instead, she laughed again, harder this time. And something in his shoulders, loosened that she hadn't noticed, was tense, until it wasn't anymore. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them named out loud. She'd arrive at whichever property needed her that day, sketches tucked under one arm, and more often than not she'd find him already there, standing in a half-finished room with his hands in his pockets, studying the light the way she did, as if he were trying to see the space the way she saw it rather than the way a balance sheet would. "You don't need to be here for paint samples," she told him once, holding up 2 nearly identical swatches of warm white. "I don't need to be here for a lot of things," he said. "I'm here anyway." She started noticing small habits of his that no headline about Kang Global Holdings had ever mentioned. The way he always let her finish a thought before responding, even when she trailed off mid-sentence chasing a better word. The way he remembered, without being reminded, that she took her coffee with too much cream and pretended not to be embarrassed about it. The way he never once, in all those weeks, asked her a single question about Henry, though he must have wondered. One evening, after a long day finishing the mood boards for the harbor restoration, they ended up on the building's unfinished rooftop terrace, watching the city lights come up one district at a time as the sun went down. "Can I ask you something?" she said, leaning against the railing. "You can ask. I reserve the right not to answer." "Fair." She turned to look at him. "Why me? You could have anyone design these buildings. Better credentials, bigger portfolios, people who wouldn't need saving off a bridge first." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might actually decline to answer. "Because you set down the flowers," he said finally. "You didn't scream. You didn't fall apart in front of 300 people who were half-hopping you would, because pain is entertaining when it's not yours. You just set them down and walked out with your spine straight. I've spent my whole life around people performing strength they don't have. That night, I watched someone carry the real thing, quietly, like it cost her everything, and she paid it anyway." Sasha didn't have an answer for that. She looked out at the skyline instead, feeling something in her chest loosen that had been clenched shut since the moment Henry let go of her hand. She told Tia about it later that week, sitting cross-legged on Tia's living room floor with a bowl of noodles going cold between them, and found herself struggling to explain what exactly was happening without making it sound bigger than she was ready to admit. "He remembers things," Sasha said. "Not important things. Small things. I mentioned once in passing that I hate elevators with mirrors because I always end up staring at myself the whole ride. Every building we've worked on since, he's had the mirrored panels replaced before I even step inside." Tia raised an eyebrow over her chopsticks. "That's not small, Sasha. That's a man paying attention." "It's probably just good business. He likes his designers comfortable." "Since when do CEOs personally reroute construction schedules for their designers' comfort?" Tia set down her bowl. "You've spent 6 years convincing yourself that love means doing everything and getting nothing back. This is the opposite of that, and you don't know what to do with it because it doesn't feel like sacrifice." Sasha didn't answer right away. She thought about the coat on the bridge, the coffee that never got mentioned again, the paint swatches, the mirrors. None of it added up to a declaration. All of it added up to something she was beginning to suspect mattered more than one. "I'm not ready to call it anything," she said finally. "Nobody's asking you to," Tia said. "Just don't talk yourself out of noticing it." While Sasha's world was slowly widening to include quiet dinners at the estate and long drives, where neither of them said much of anything, another world had already begun watching her with considerably less warmth. In a private room 3 floors below one of the properties she'd renovated, 7 men sat around a lacquered table, none of them smiling. The underboss stood near the door while Doha's consigliere spoke, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood exactly how much weight they carried. "The woman is becoming a conversation," the consigliere said. "Not among our people, among theirs." Doha didn't look up from the report in front of him. "Which families?" "2, so far. They're asking why the supreme boss personally oversees property renovations. They're asking why he attends design meetings that any junior director could handle." "Let them ask." "With respect," the underboss said, stepping forward. "Questions like that don't stay questions for long. Eventually, someone decides to answer them for themselves." Doha closed the folder. "Then they'll get the wrong answer, because the right one is none of their business." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms, full of dangerous men, go quiet when they've decided not to push further, at least not yet. It was the consigliere who spoke again, softer this time. "She has no idea what she's involved in, does she?" "No," Doha said, "and she won't until I decide she needs to." That decision was taken out of his hands 2 weeks later. Sasha had stayed late at the estate finishing a mood board for the East Wing, and by the time she packed up her things, most of the household staff had gone for the evening. She took a wrong turn heading toward the exit, ending up in a corridor she hadn't been shown before, lined with framed photographs. Doha as a boy, standing beside an older man with the same sharp jaw and steady eyes, both of them formally dressed in front of what looked like a ceremonial gathering. She lingered too long in front of one photograph in particular. Doha, maybe 25, kneeling before a circle of older men, his head bowed, receiving something that looked less like a business honor and more like an oath. "You're not supposed to be down here." She turned. The underboss stood at the end of the corridor, arms folded, his expression unreadable. "I got lost," she said. I'll head back. Do you know what this house is? He asked, not unkindly, but with a weight that stopped her mid-turn. It's Doha's family estate. It's the seat of the largest organization operating outside the law in this country, he said plainly. Every man in these photographs commands people the police are too frightened to touch. And the boy kneeling in that photo isn't just a businessman who happens to own real estate. He's the supreme boss. He has been for 6 years. Sasha felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though she hadn't moved. She stood in that corridor for a long while after the underboss walked away, staring at the photograph of the boy kneeling before a circle of men, trying to reconcile it with the version of Doha who'd once spent 20 minutes helping her choose between 2 shades of white paint because he wanted to get it right for her. Both versions were true. That was the part that frightened her most, not that he'd lied, but that he hadn't needed to lie, because she'd simply never asked the right question. She found Doha in his study 20 minutes later, still in the shirt he'd worn to their afternoon meeting, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a glass of something amber untouched on the desk in front of him. He looked up when she entered, and for the first time since she'd known him, looked almost afraid. You should have told me, she said. Her voice didn't shake, which surprised her. I know. All those buildings, the retreat, the club, the executive floor, are all connected to my organization, he finished for her. Yes. She stood there, arms crossed, waiting for the fear to arrive the way it was supposed to. It didn't come. Instead, what surfaced was something closer to anger, sharpened by the specific humiliation of realizing she'd been the only person in every room who hadn't understood what she was standing in. Have you ever used that power to hurt innocent people? She asked, not as an accusation. As a genuine question, one she needed answered before she decided what came next. Doha didn't flinch from it. I've made decisions that cost people things they valued. I've never hurt someone who didn't first choose violence themselves. I don't touch civilians. I don't touch families. The men who came before me didn't always follow that rule. I do. That's supposed to make this better. No, he said. It's supposed to be true. What you do with it is yours to decide. Now would be a good time to drop a comment telling me what you think Sasha should do next. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss where this goes from here. She sat with him a while longer that night. And for the first time, he told her more pieces of the life he never discussed with anyone outside his organization. The years of proving himself to men twice his age, who assumed his composure was weakness. The particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who respected him and feared him in roughly equal measure, and never quite loved him in a way that didn't come with conditions attached. You're the first person outside my world who's looked at me like I'm still a person, he admitted, and not just a title people bow to. I haven't decided yet what I think of you, she said. Don't confuse honesty with forgiveness. I'm not asking for either. I'm just done lying to you. How did it happen? She asked, sitting back in her chair, arms still crossed but her voice quieter now. You said your grandfather handed you leadership before you were ready. How does that happen to a person? One day you're a boy in a photograph and the next you're this. My father was supposed to inherit it first, Doha said, his eyes fixed on some point past her shoulder. He died before he could. Car accident, though I spent years believing it wasn't an accident at all, and some days I still do. I was 22. My grandfather had 2 choices: hand the organization to men who'd fight each other for it the moment he stepped back, or hand it to a 22-year-old who'd spent his whole life being groomed for a business degree, not a war. He chose you. He chose me, and for the first 3 years, half my own inner circle waited for me to fail so they could take it from me properly. He finally looked at her again. I learned to stop trusting rooms full of people very early. You're the first room I've been in a long time where I didn't feel like I had to watch my back. That's a low bar, she said, but there was no edge in it anymore. Maybe it's still true. She studied him for a long moment, weighing everything he'd just handed her against everything she still didn't know. I need you to understand something, she said finally. I just watched a man I trusted for 6 years turn out to be someone completely different than who I thought he was. I can't do that twice in 1 year and survive it. Then I'll make sure you never have to find out anything about me the way you found out about this house, he said. Ask me anything, whenever you want it. I'd rather you leave knowing the truth than stay because you never learned it. She didn't leave that night, though she thought about it. Something shifted between them that night, quiet and unspoken, the kind of shift that doesn't announce itself with declarations but reveals itself later. In the way she stopped flinching when his hand brushed hers passing a cup of tea. In the way he started clearing his schedule for her without being asked. Ashanti found out about the estate visits the way jealousy always finds the information it's looking for, through a photograph, forwarded by someone who thought she'd want to know, showing Sasha stepping out of a car in front of the Kang estate gates. She stared at the photo for a long time on her phone, her thumb hovering over it, before showing it to Henry over dinner at a restaurant considerably more expensive than the ones they'd frequented 6 months earlier. She's supposed to be the one who lost everything, Ashanti said, setting the phone down harder than necessary. Not living in some billionaire's mansion. Henry glanced at the photo without much interest. It's a work thing. She's an interior designer. It's probably a contract. You didn't see her face in that photo. Ashanti's voice tightened. She looked happy, Henry. She's supposed to be falling apart. That was the whole point. Henry set down his fork, studying her with an expression that had started to carry, more and more often lately, a flicker of something like regret he refused to name out loud. You wanted her humiliated. She's humiliated. What more do you need? I need her to stay that way. Listen to yourself. He kept his voice low, aware of the tables around them. You spent 2 years convincing me that leaving her at the altar was the only way we'd ever get to be together honestly. I did it, publicly, in front of everyone we know, and now you're sitting here obsessing over a photograph of her standing outside a building. Because it proves it didn't work, Ashanti said, and for the first time that evening her voice cracked slightly, revealing something underneath the anger that looked almost like fear. I didn't do all of that so she could land somewhere better than either of us. Do you understand what it would mean if Sasha ends up happy? Everyone who ever compared us my whole life chose her. The responsible one. The reliable one. I finally had something she didn't have, and I need it to stay that way. Henry didn't answer right away. He reached for his wine instead, turning the glass slowly by its stem, and in the silence that followed, something passed behind his eyes that Ashanti either didn't notice or chose not to acknowledge. The particular unease of a man beginning to understand, too late, that the woman across from him had never been chasing love so much as she'd been chasing a scoreboard only she could see. It was Ashanti who leaked the first story to a gossip outlet, an anonymous tip claiming that Sasha had seduced her way into Kang Group within weeks of her failed wedding, trading her broken engagement for a billionaire's sympathy, and, implicitly, his bed. The story spread fast, the way stories about wounded women and powerful men always do, gaining details with each retelling that had never existed in the first place. Sasha found out from Tia, who called her in a state somewhere between fury and panic. You need to see this before someone else shows it to you. Sasha read the article standing in her kitchen, her coffee going cold beside her. The comments underneath were worse than the article itself. Strangers deciding, with total confidence, exactly what kind of woman she must be to have recovered from betrayal by attaching herself to the next wealthy man available. She didn't cry. She'd spent all the tears she had access to weeks ago, at the wedding and in the days after. What she felt instead was a colder, steadier anger, the kind that made her hands very still. Doha called within the hour, having seen the story through channels considerably faster than public news cycles. I can make this disappear, he said. The outlet, the writer, the original source. Say the word. Don't, Sasha said. If you bury it with power, it just confirms what they're already saying about me. Then, what do you want me to do? Nothing, for now. Let me handle what I can handle myself. The next morning, Sasha did the one thing the article's author probably hadn't accounted for. She went to work. She showed up at the harbor restoration site at the same hour she always did, portfolio under her arm, and when 2 of the site foremen exchanged glances as she walked past, she stopped, looked directly at them, and asked which one of them needed the tile samples she'd brought. You don't have to prove anything to us, one of them said, clearly uncomfortable. I know, Sasha said. I'm here because I have a job to finish, not because I owe anyone an explanation for surviving my own wedding. Word of that reached Doha before lunch, relayed by one of the site managers with something close to admiration in his voice. Doha didn't call her about it. Instead, he had a single bouquet delivered to the site that afternoon, not roses, not anything performative, just a modest bundle of ranunculus, the same flower she'd set down on a church pew weeks earlier. No note. He didn't need to leave one. She understood exactly what he was telling her, that he'd noticed, and that he thought the flowers deserved better company than a pew she'd walked away from. What she couldn't have known was that the story wasn't only reaching gossip readers. It was reaching rival organizations who'd been watching the situation with growing interest, men who understood, better than any tabloid reader, exactly what it meant when the supreme boss allowed a civilian close enough to become a headline. Within the council, the loose alliance of family heads who governed the uneasy peace between organizations across the region, the story became something far more dangerous than gossip. It became intelligence. She's a liability now, one rival boss said during a private communication intercepted and relayed to Doha's consigliere within hours. Not because of who she is, because of what she represents. The supreme boss has a weakness, and now everyone knows her name. The man on the other end of that call ran one of the smaller families along the southern coast, a family that had spent a decade watching Doha's organization grow, while their own influence quietly shrank. He wasn't interested in violence, not yet. He was interested in leverage, and leverage required information. The kind of information only someone inside the estate itself could reliably provide. Find out who handles her schedule, he told his own second-in-command. Find out who drives her, who lets her through the gates, who knows which nights she stays late. Every organization has someone who resents standing in the shadow of the man at the top. Find that person for me. It didn't take long. Loyalty, it turned out, was rarely as absolute as it appeared from the outside, and somewhere within Doha's own carefully built circle, a door had already been quietly left open. Doha called an emergency meeting of his inner circle that same night. Naren, his grandfather, arrived despite his retirement, drawn by instinct alone, sensing something in his grandson's voice over the phone that hadn't been there in years. You're protecting her the way a man protects something he's already decided he can't live without, Naren said quietly, once the others had left the room. That's not weakness, Doha. That's the first honest thing I've seen in you since your father died. It's also exactly what our enemies will use against me. Then don't let them use it, Naren said. Make it something they're afraid to touch instead. Before Doha's assembled underboss, consigliere, and senior advisors the following morning, he made the declaration that would ripple through every family watching from the shadows. From today, Sasha's safety comes before everything else. Anyone who has a problem with that has a problem with me. The room absorbed it in silence. Every man present understood exactly what those words meant, that an outsider had, in the span of a few months, been placed under the direct personal protection of the most powerful man in the organization, a status normally reserved for blood family alone. Chairman Naren welcomed her formally into the estate 2 nights later, a quiet dinner meant to be nothing more than a gesture of goodwill. The dining room was smaller than she expected for a house of that scale, warmly lit, with a single long table set for 3 instead of the imposing banquet hall she'd half braced herself for. Forgive an old man's curiosity, Naren said partway through the meal, setting down his chopsticks. What did you think of my grandson the first night you met him, before you knew any of what he carried? Sasha considered the question honestly. I thought he was strange. He didn't ask what happened to me. He didn't try to fix it or explain it or tell me it would get better. He just sat there, in the rain, like keeping me company was reason enough to be there. Naren smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with something that looked like old grief settling briefly into something gentler. That's the boy I raised him to be, underneath everything the organization required of him. I was afraid I'd buried that part of him the day I handed him this life. It's good to know it survived." He took her hand across the table then, with the gentleness of a man who'd buried more than he'd ever discuss openly, and said only, "My grandson has been many things in his life. He has never once looked at a woman the way he looks at you." Sasha didn't know how to answer that, so she didn't try. "He'll deny it if you tell him I said this," Naren added, releasing her hand and returning to his meal. "But he stopped sleeping properly the week after your wedding fell apart. Not because of guilt, because he couldn't stop wondering if you were all right. I've known that boy his entire life. I have never once seen him lose sleep over a stranger." Across the table, Doha said nothing, though the tips of his ears had gone faintly red, and Sasha found herself smiling for the second time that week without any effort at all. But not every advisor in the room shared Naren's warmth. Two senior figures pulled Doha aside before dinner concluded, their concern dressed carefully in the language of loyalty rather than jealousy. "She's a beautiful distraction," one of them said, "but she's also the single greatest vulnerability this organization has had in a decade. Rival families are already asking whether they could reach you through her." "Then we make certain they can't," Doha said, ending the conversation before it could continue. That resolve was tested faster than anyone anticipated. 2 nights later, Sasha's phone rang past midnight with a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail, exhausted from another long day finishing the estate's east wing, but something made her answer. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, unmistakably male, and entirely unfamiliar. "You should ask Doha," the voice said. "Who inside his own house has been feeding your photographs to people who want you gone?" Sasha sat up straight in bed, her heart suddenly loud in her own ears. "Who is this?" "Someone who thinks you deserve to know what you've walked into," the voice said. "The photograph that ended up in that tabloid didn't come from a stranger with a long lens outside the gates. It came from someone who already had access, someone Doha trusts enough to let close to you." "Why would you tell me that?" "Because some of us don't think civilians should be caught in the middle of what's coming," the voice said, and there was something underneath the words that almost sounded like weariness. "Ask him. Watch his face when you do." The line went dead before she could respond. She sat frozen on the edge of her bed for a long moment before calling Doha directly. He arrived at her apartment within 20 minutes, still in the clothes he'd been wearing at a late business dinner, his expression unreadable in the low light of her hallway. "Someone called me," she said before he could speak. "They said the leak about the estate photos, the tip that started the tabloid story, it didn't come from outside. It came from inside your own organization." For the first time since she'd known him, Doha went completely still, the kind of stillness that wasn't calm at all but something closer to controlled fury. "Say that again," he said quietly. She repeated it, word for word, watching something shift behind his eyes, not disbelief, but recognition, as though a suspicion he'd been holding at a distance had just been confirmed. "There's a mole," he said, almost to himself. "Someone close enough to know when you visit the estate, someone close enough to know which car brings you through the gates." "Who would do that?" "I don't know yet," he said, "but I intend to find out before the council decides to act on what they know." He didn't get the chance to investigate quietly, though not for lack of trying. The security chief doubled Sasha's protection within the hour, without asking her permission and without apologizing for the intrusion. A car began following a discreet distance behind hers on the drive, to and from every property. 2 men she'd never met took up rotating positions near the entrance of her apartment building, polite enough to nod when she passed, but never explaining themselves, and she'd learned enough about this world by then not to ask. She noticed the black sedan parked across from the harbor site 3 mornings in a row before she mentioned it to anyone. It wasn't one of Doha's vehicles. She'd learned to recognize those by now, the particular tint of the windows, the discreet detail along the grille, and something about the way it idled, engine running, driver never stepping out, unsettled her enough that she photographed the license plate on her phone before heading inside. She showed the photo to the security chief that afternoon. His expression didn't change, which somehow frightened her more than if it had. "How long has it been there?" he asked. 3 days, maybe longer. I only started paying attention because it never moves." He was already dialing before she finished the sentence. Within the hour, the plate came back registered to a shell company with ties, several layers removed, to the same southern coastal family that had spent the past 2 weeks quietly gathering information on every routine detail of her life. "They're not planning to hurt you," the security chief told her, choosing his words with visible care. "Not yet. Watching is a message on its own. It tells the supreme boss they know exactly how close they could get if they wanted to. And if they decide they want to. Then you'll never see the car again," he said, "because we'll have already moved you somewhere they can't find." That night, when she told Doha about the sedan, something in his face closed the way it had the first night the council's suspicion had been mentioned aloud. He didn't say much. He simply picked up his phone, made 3 calls in succession, each one shorter and colder than the last. And by morning, the sedan was gone, and 2 additional guards had been stationed permanently outside her apartment without further discussion. "You don't have to do all of this," she told him, watching him from the kitchen doorway as he ended the 3rd call. "I know," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." It was the same answer he'd given her on the bridge, all those weeks ago, when she'd told him she hadn't asked for company. She was starting to understand that this, showing up uninvited, protecting without permission, choosing her without waiting to be chosen back, was simply the shape of how he loved, long before either of them had used that word out loud. Whoever had made that late-night call to Sasha's phone had been right about one thing. The leak was close, closer than Doha wanted to admit even to himself, and every hour he spent trying to trace it quietly was an hour the council spent deciding they'd waited long enough. 3 nights later, past midnight, the iron gates of the Kang estate opened for a convoy no one had summoned. More than 20 black armored vehicles rolled up the long driveway in silence, headlights cutting through the dark like a slow-moving warning. One by one, the leaders of Korea's most powerful families stepped out onto the gravel, their expressions carrying the particular weight of men who had already made a decision and come only to deliver it. Inside, Doha had been sitting across from Sasha in the small parlor off the main hall, a cup of tea cooling untouched in front of her, the two of them caught in the middle of an ordinary conversation about nothing important at all. The kind of conversation people have when they've finally allowed themselves to feel safe. She'd been telling him, of all things, about a mural she wanted to commission for the East Wing stairwell, sketching the shape of it in the air with her hands, and he'd been watching her do it with the particular stillness of a man memorizing something he was afraid might not last. Neither of them heard the gates open. It was the sound of gravel under 24 sets of tires, low and grinding, that finally reached the parlor windows, and Sasha watched Doha's whole posture change in the space of a single breath. Shoulders squaring, jaw setting, the warmth that had been sitting easily on his face folding itself away into something colder and infinitely more careful. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Doha." "Please." It wasn't a command. It was the first time she'd heard him ask her for anything. The underboss appeared in the doorway, breathless, his usual composure cracked at the edges. "Supreme Boss," he said, bowing quickly. "The council has arrived, every family head. They're demanding an immediate decision." Doha rose slowly from his chair, his eyes finding Sasha's across the small distance between them. "About what?" she asked, though some part of her already understood. "About you," he said, "and about whoever inside these walls decided you were worth selling out." He crossed the room, stopping just before the doorway, and turned back to look at her one final time. "No matter what happens tonight," he said quietly, "no one touches her." Then he walked toward the mansion's front doors, which opened slowly onto the gathered council waiting in the dark, more than 20 of the most dangerous men in the country standing in his driveway. Sasha moved to the parlor window despite everything in her that said not to, and through the gap in the curtain she watched Doha stop at the top of the entrance steps, facing men who could end his life with a single word to the right person, standing perfectly straight the way she had once stood in front of 300 wedding guests who'd expected her to break. One of the family heads stepped forward first, an older man with silver hair and a face carved into permanent disapproval, and though she couldn't hear the words through the glass, she could read the shape of them in his posture, a demand, not a request. Doha didn't move. He didn't reach for the underboss standing half a step behind him, didn't glance toward the house where she stood watching. He simply waited, letting the silence stretch until it belonged to him instead of them, the same stillness she remembered from a stone bridge in the rain, except now it looked less like patience and more like the calm of a man fully prepared for whatever came next. Behind her, unnoticed in the doorway of the parlor, someone else was watching the same scene unfold. Someone who had access to every hallway in that house, who knew exactly which nights Sasha stayed late and exactly which car brought her through the gates, who had already decided, long before that convoy arrived, precisely how this night needed to end. Sasha didn't see them yet. She was still watching Doha, still holding her breath, still waiting to find out whether the man who'd once given a heartbroken stranger his coat in the rain would walk back through those doors at all. And somewhere among his own trusted circle, a traitor who already knew exactly how this night was supposed to end simply watched and waited and said nothing. The doors closed behind him, and the screen went black. If you felt that ending in your chest, that's exactly where I need you to be right now. Like this video, subscribe so you don't miss part 2, and tell me in the comments who you think the traitor is, because trust me, you are going to want to be here when the truth comes out.